Anyway, yeah, we're really happy that you're here again. I actually decided to become a psychology major when I first took psychology of video games. I'm a pretty big gamer. I played video games my whole life, and I was kind of like confused about what I really wanted to study at university. I saw that I was looking at I was browsing catalogs one day and I was looking at the psychology catalogs and I'm like, wow, there's a class on psychology of video games. I've never heard that before. So I looked up the professor and I was like looking up all that stuff. I found his YouTube page. It was pretty interesting. Look that up. But so I ended up becoming a psychology major and I took that class and I was like, oh man, this is great. Like I want to dedicate my life to this. I want to go get my PhD. I want to research video games. So that's kind of how I got started into video games. And there's a lot within video games that you can study in psychology. There will be a plug in a little bit for another panel tomorrow that's going to talk about academia. I'll let her do it. But there is a lot that we're going to go over. However, we're going to be somewhat brief on each of them because there are a lot of different directions we can go in. So think of this more as like a 101 class. Oh, sorry. Think of it more as like a 101 class because it's going to be kind of brief about each subject. Okay. So this is the slide if you want to read it. There you go. Yeah. Yeah, we'll go on the next slide. Thanks. I've focused a lot of my research on violent video games. Does anyone like violent video games here? Wow. Have you guys become more aggressive since playing violent video games? Well, no one's throwing anything at me yet, so. But anyway, I focused a lot of my research on violent video games. As probably many of you are aware, there's a decent amount of research within this kind of subcategory. A lot of the research is done by non-gamers. I mean, I feel like a lot of research in video games and stuff is done by non-gamers anyway. But anyway, a lot of the literature that has already been published in video games and violence has kind of been more targeted towards trying to develop a causal relationship between video games and violence. What does that really mean? That means that the person writing the article or the person that did the experiment is saying that video games cause violence. Now that's a pretty bold statement. It's a pretty bold statement to make, I think, and so who are these people? And I don't really want to name drop, but I am going to name drop because you can look it up. You can go on Google and just type in video game violence and these are the people that kind of come up. Where did it kind of come to fruition? Well, it kind of came to fruition a little bit after Columbine shooting. That's when this whole controversy surrounding video games and violence really kind of came about. Some of the families from the shooting were putting the blame on the video game companies rather than on anything else But anyway, they put the blame on the video game companies. There were lawsuits, and this kind of started to develop the controversy a little bit, and so that's kind of where it was at. That was back in 1999. In the year 2000, only 1 year later, now that it's getting pretty popular, 1 year later, Craig Anderson and a colleague, they publish a two-stage causal model, which attempts to demonstrate a causal relationship between playing video games and becoming more aggressive, becoming more violent. So you can, we're actually doing here's my shameless plug. We're doing a panel tomorrow on video game violence where I'm going to be able to talk a little bit more about. I'm going to be able to talk a little bit more about it, and I'll go a little bit more in depth. It's at 2:30, so you should come. But anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. But pretty much the bottom line that I wanted to talk about right now. Well, I'm almost done talking, but the little last bit that I wanted to say was that it's not as black and white as people think. And you guys probably know that. You guys probably know. This guy is agreeing with me, I think. He's gesturing. He's nodding his head. He's probably agreeing with me. It's not as black and white. There is conflicting evidence and conflicting research in the field. If you look up a researcher named Ferguson. I think he works in Texas. He does a lot of video game research too, and a lot of his stuff, he did a whole meta-analysis, which is pretty much just a compilation of many different studies, and he pretty much like destroys a lot of like Craig Anderson's work. So you should check it out, but I'll talk more about that tomorrow. But yeah, that's one area where if you like video games, if you like psychology, you can kind of get your feet wet into this kind of research. So yeah, I'm gonna pass the mic now to Anne-Marie.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about video game addiction, which is a huge topic that's in contention right now. Actually, just in October, my colleague Michelle Karras and I just published a study that we did here at MAGFest on video game addiction. Was anybody there for those panels in 2016, 2017? Oh, yeah, we had someone there. So we actually used these discussion groups to talk about what gamers think gaming addiction is. And tomorrow at 10 a.m., I know it's super early in the morning, we're going to go over the results that you guys at MAGFest helped us collect and create and publish. But anyway, to go into the topic, how many people know what the DSM is? Okay, so most people do. So for those who don't, it's a diagnostic and statistical manual, and it's what clinicians use to diagnose people with mental disorders. And internet gaming disorder is one under contention. So it's within the DSM, but it's not an official disorder yet. It's still, they're asking for more research before they make it an official disorder. So these are the 8 criteria, just for your reference, on what constitutes internet gaming addiction. But there are some issues, and this is what we did in our study at MAGFest, where some of these criteria make sense and some of them don't when it comes to internet gaming disorder. They derived a lot of these from alcohol addiction or gambling addiction, which are not at all the same thing. So for instance, tolerance. So tolerance in alcohol means an actual biological tolerance, like you actually need more alcohol to feel the same effects. But when you're talking about playing video games, it doesn't really work the same way. Like, it does affect your neurotransmitters, your dopamine, but it is not the same physical effects. So it's really weird that some of these criteria don't really match. Same thing with withdrawal. So like with alcohol or drugs, you'll have physical withdrawal symptoms. And maybe you do with gaming as well, but at most it's like irritability. Like you're just angry that you're maybe not playing the game or you're worried about not playing the game, but it's not quite the same thing. So that's why there's a call for a lot more research to look into these criteria to see if they're actually appropriate. And the reason it's getting more contentious is the World Health Organization is officially including gaming disorder before it's been hashed out. So people are starting to take it more seriously, but before it's been thoroughly researched and these criteria are really worked out to the best they can be. So that's kind of the overall state of gaming addiction right now. And the other consideration for gaming addiction is how fast the gaming world evolves. And can you really keep up with these criteria as it changes faster and faster? So this is just my own thought. I haven't seen this in research yet. But now, since this is year of the loot boxes and microtransactions, it's weird. It's actually almost becoming more like a gambling disorder, maybe. So maybe some of these criteria match better than they did before. So that's the thing, is like, how do you keep up with these criteria when the games themselves and the nature of gaming changes so quickly? Are we taking questions now or at the end?
Oh yeah, can we leave questions to the end? I think in the description it said that this was a discussion. Sorry, that was a mistake.
Okay.
But at the end.
But
our fault. It's my fault. You blame me.
Keep it in your brain.
Sorry.
And we'll definitely leave time for questions. So I think we're going to move on to the social aspects of gaming.
All right. So just as a broad kind of overview, social aspects of gaming, a lot of it is fairly self-explanatory. When you think of social interactions, probably the thing that comes to the forefront of your mind most of the time would be multiplayer games. And a lot of people might expect that social gaming has only really been relevant in the very recent years with a lot of the advent of MMOs with World of Warcraft in 2004, and then obviously the rise of the online competitive video game culture, tying into esports, which is a little relevant to what I do currently. But social aspects in gaming actually tie pretty far back to actually the gaming's inception. A lot of times even back then, there were a lot of instances of multiplayer games. Also, when you're interacting within that kind of gaming space, a lot of times you do have social aspects tie into how the characters interact and how you might interact when you're role-playing a character interacting with others. And so just to start with some of the basic concepts, if you guys have taken a psychology class, you probably have heard of some of these at least. But I feel like in my own life, they're always super applicable, even in the gaming space, in the psychology space, whenever in any type of interaction, they're always super helpful to kind of keep in mind. So the first of which being the fundamental attribution error. It's week one psychology a lot of times, but basically if you're not familiar with it, it's the idea that the situation that a person is in affects them much more than the type of person they are. And that is incredibly applicable when you take that into social aspects and social interactions, situations where people are interacting in a lot of different ways. So in its purest form, a lot of times when you're playing multiplayer games, you might be playing with somebody online in Overwatch or League of Legends or something of the sort, and you just think to yourself, man, how can this teammate be such a jerk? I can't fathom how they could be so mean, so toxic. A lot of times in those situations, it's really important to remember that, especially in online competition where you're expected to perform in very high pressure situations, a lot of times, a lot of those situational factors play a huge role in not only your physiological response interacting with the game space and interacting with its people, but just your mentality approaching all the different situations. And that also ties in to the locus of control, the next kind of point here, which is basically the idea of how you think you can influence your own life. So internal locus of control would reference the idea that you think you have control over your own destiny. You think that you have the agency to affect the change you want to see. Whereas an external locus of control is very often heard. If you've been playing with a lot of people and a lot of online games for a while, you've 100% heard this kind of rhetoric, the idea that, oh my gosh, my stupid team keeps feeding. Why are there so many AFKs? It's impossible to climb up in the ranked ladder. Or this is so dumb. This character is so busted in Street Fighter. How could they let that slide? How could the developer do that kind of thing? And there are a lot of other factors that obviously play into all those different situations. But locus of control is something that the person, as the player, you can actually control if you kind of internalize the outcomes and the interactions you have with different people. That lets you believe that you have a lot more power to do what you want with the space, and that actually ends up kind of helping you better your own play. If you basically, to put it simply, if you stop making excuses, you can try to focus on actually improving your own interaction in the space. And so, I don't know what this picture is.
It's a flow diagram.
All right, there we go. So, how many of you guys have heard of something called the prisoner's dilemma? Nice, a lot of you. So, yeah, for those of you who haven't heard, the prisoner's dilemma is a classic example of different types of cooperation versus competition within a gaming environment. And I mean gaming in its purest form, gaming as in kind of operant conditioning principles, Skinner type things. So not necessarily video games, but basically with the tit for tat, tit for tat is an iteration of that. But the prisoner's dilemma was a study that was several decades ago where a bunch of psychologists interacted with two prisoners. And basically, the premise is person A and person B had both been arrested as suspects for a crime. And they're being held in separate rooms. It's impossible for them to communicate with each other at all. Now, The police officer goes to each one of these people and gives them two options. He says, listen, you can either rat out your friend, or his other option is to remain silent, not kind of give up his friend. So that leads to 4 different scenarios, where the first scenario is both people rat out each other because they think that, oh, maybe if the other guy can take the fall for the blame of this incident, I can get off scot-free. So the first scenario is that both people betray each other and that both people rat each other out. The second scenario is that one person rats the other one out and the second person stays silent. In that situation, the person that stayed silent actually benefits from that interaction because the person that ratted the other person out benefits from that interaction for betraying their friend, because obviously if they can pin the crime on somebody, then they'll let the guy go for cooperating. The other so I say 4 options. 2 of those options are that person A rats out person B, and then person B rats out person A. Then the 4th option would be that both people stay silent, and if both people stay silent, they both get punished, but to a lesser extent. So what these researchers found was that overwhelmingly people would actually tend to cooperate with their friend even without being able to communicate. And they wouldn't want to betray their friend even though there is a better option of the possibility of ratting out their friend and then getting away with 0 implication, 0 consequence for their crime. So that was kind of a seminal study showing that people do have an inherent desire to want to cooperate with each other in a variety of different spaces. Especially if you're a prisoner in this kind of situation, that's a severe type of consequence. If you might go to jail, you might go to prison for years as a result of that. And so one iteration of this prisoner's dilemma is the tit for tat. The tit for tat type is an interaction where basically they only had one prisoner. They didn't have a second person. And so what they did was they gave them the option, you can rat out person B, which didn't actually exist, or you can stay silent about person B. And what they had happen for person B to interact in this situation was they would actually replay back what person A did and how person A acted. So eventually, basically everything A would do, person B would replicate at some point. And they also found that people would overwhelmingly cooperate in a large majority of these cases. People would learn that cooperation is better, and they would inherently have that natural inclination toward that kind of state. So tying that back into gaming, video gaming rather, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of times people want to cooperate. There are a lot of outside stressors, going back to the fundamental attribution error. Understand that sometimes people have a bad day. Sometimes they only have 2 hours to play 5 games of Overwatch, and if 1/5 of their entire gaming for that evening is ruined by one mishap, that can really destroy their kind of self-concept of how they want to spend their evening. They have this idea going into it, I'm going to do this, I'm going to spend my time in this, I'm going to rank up, maybe they're trying to prove to themselves, prove to somebody else that they're a certain rank or they can do certain things in the game. And when other situational factors affect that, that can really upset them. And then that would then translate to behavioral interactions with the other players. And in this kind of competitive online space particularly, ties in a lot to performance psychology and this kind of flow state of trying to perform at peak levels, which is often thrown around with like coaches and stuff, but basically that's the idea that if you, to go back for a second, if you try to perform in front of an audience or try to do a task in front of an audience, your success at that task is dependent on your familiarity with its process. So if I were to come up here and then play tic-tac-toe, something, maybe do like very simple math, something that I'm fairly good at, then it would be pretty easy for me. I would be able to get socially facilitated by that, having that audience there to kind of cheer me on in something I'm confident I can do.
2 times 2.
2.
4.
4. But if
I guess not.
if I come up here and somebody asks me to give a panel in front of hundreds of people or 100 people, do something that's a little more difficult. Sometimes that gets a little bit antsy. So a lot of times when you're presented with the actual same scenario, but it's a different subject or a different task that's a lot more difficult or something you haven't exactly mastered, the classic, I think, example in this case would be like tying a shoelace or doing a task that you've never really tried before. You get the reverse of that as social inhibition. So even if my average at any given task was 50, if it's something I'm comfortable doing a lot, then it bumps up to 75 when I'm doing it in front of a bunch of people. They have that adrenaline. They're able to better focus. They're able to kind of activate at maybe a better level. But then if it's something they're really unfamiliar with, that might drop to a 35, just because you have that adrenaline again, your heart's pumping really fast, but you get really caught up in the moment sometimes, and that can be really detrimental to your ability to perform. So along that note, the flow state is once you practice something enough times, your brain eventually gets to a state where you don't think about the actions you're doing. So for instance, when you take competitive rifle shooters, tying into good old Tennessee boy over here, he really likes rifle shooters. It's actually pretty fun. He took me out one time, but I digress. Professional shooters, they would, when they're trying to compete at the top level, and this ties into also all kinds of sports and eventually video games, which I'll get around to at some point. Basically, if they think about their actions, they perform worse. And to actually perform at their highest level, they just focus on things unrelated to the actual actions, like breathing and looking at the target, but not even thinking about positioning because they've trained that. So a lot of times that does, and I think I'm running a little bit long. I'll try to give them save a little time for the end. We haven't really hit halfway, but I do want to let them talk. So a lot of times when you're in these social spaces, you also get instances of a lot of conformity. The classic case of that is throwing your mic on the desk and making everyone's ears pop. But there's a study, I think, by Ash. It was a line study. This is also very kind of intro to psychology type scenario that you go over, where if a lot of people, they found essentially that if you have a group of a lot of people and they're all displaying incorrect information, even if it's undeniably wrong, that people tend to conform more than they tend to actually stand up for themselves and speak out against the truth. And this plays a lot into aspects of, I don't want to get super controversial, but aspects of discrimination in online interaction, where a lot of times people have a certain groupthink for, not even in terms of like demographic type stuff, but if you play a lot of esports, people think this is the meta. How could you possibly try to do something outside of the meta? And a lot of times the meta develops because it is numerically the best option, but a lot of people fall into these ruts of conformity, trying to just adhere to what the groupthink kind of mentality is. So yeah, key takeaways, just try to keep in mind that situations play a huge role in people's interactions. And then I guess the actual verbiage of the fundamental attribution error, as an example that's usually used, is that you judge other people by their actions, whereas you judge yourself by your situation. So that might have been the most useful thing I've ever learned in psychology, and I learned it in my first week of studying it. So there you go. I'll pass it on to Javon. Just kidding. This is good old boomerang panel.
Sorry, you have to hear me talk again. Hope that's okay. So you hear all this negative stuff about video game in the media sometimes, about how video games cause aggression, violence, addiction. So my passion in health psychology was to find ways that we could use video games to benefit society and people and treat mental health and physical health conditions. And that's a huge field that, we definitely need more people researching and creating serious games in this now. Where I started working in a chronic pain lab where we use video games to distract people feeling pain during medical procedures. For instance, like children undergoing burn wound treatments, they would watch or play a video game during the procedure, which is really long. I mean, it takes like almost up to an hour sometimes, so you want something to distract them. Or they also use it for dental procedures too. So just imagine being like in the dental chair and being able to play a video game while you're getting that cavity drilled instead of just like sitting there watching HGTV. So like that's a lot of what the pain literature is about. But I also wanted to go over just some other really interesting topics in this field. So have people heard about how games are used to treat phobias or anxiety before? Yeah, that's a huge one. So that's done through a process called desensitization. So the idea is if someone has a phobia of airplanes, you don't want to just put them on a real airplane right away. That probably wouldn't go well. So what you do is you give them a virtual simulation of an airplane, and then you slowly make it more and more stressful, and they get used to it over time. So like, for instance, stage 1 in the virtual reality would be just sitting on the airplane. And stage 2 might be taking off in the airplane. And stage 3 might be, oh no, there's some turbulence on the airplane. And with VR getting better and better now, we're able to do these desensitization procedures even better nowadays than we could before. So you might see it already in some VR. We were talking about the one where you have to jump off a plank. What was it in the VR game? Yeah, so there's a lot of treatments for fear of heights, fear of spiders, social phobias. You can treat all types of anxiety.
Fear of video games? Fear of virtual reality?
Fear of virtual reality? Well, that might be flooding. That might be just throwing them in too quick. So what's the video game treatment for virtual reality phobia? Going
Don't do
outside.
Yeah.
So they're also treating other mental disorders like depression now. So there's a famous game called Depression Quest. I think it was made by a team in New Zealand. And that's used kind of as an introspective way to look at your emotions and physically fight the demons inside you. And I mean that, like in the game. You actually fight like the demons inside you. And there's a lot of really interesting games popping up in that sphere. The other things I wanted to talk about, phantom limb pain is a really interesting one too. Does everybody know what that is? Yeah, right. So if someone loses a limb either through trauma or through surgery, they have this pain where their limb used to be. Now with virtual reality, you can do something super cool and actually treat that pain. So what you'll do is they'll put the virtual reality glove or like the Oculus Touch or whatever in the other hand, the one that's still there, and in the virtual game, they'll flip it. So it'll look like, if you're missing your right hand, it'll look like you still have your right hand in the video game. And it actually decreases their pain. Sometimes it goes away completely with these virtual reality games that they create to do that flipping, where they can see their hand that isn't there in real life. So that's another really cool application of VR that you can do now that the technology is getting better. The other two things I just wanted to briefly touch on, using video games to reduce stress or relax you is a really new topic of study. They're especially using it with casual games, so like Bejeweled and those type of games. And they found it does actually stress you over time, especially if you have like a difficult job or something. It's nice to have that to do during the day. But there's not very much research on it yet, so that's like a new line of research. So if you're interested in starting up some research, that's a field they haven't looked at very much. And the last one I wanted to talk about, just because I think it's super cool, like that's really all why. I've seen 2 studies that say that video gamers have more lucid dreaming than other people and actually have more control over their nightmares. So they did a study with veterans who were having nightmares, about violent nightmares about their experiences in battle, and they found that the gamers actually had more control over their nightmares and had less negative consequences from them. So hey, the game can even help you sleep and help you in your dreams too. So yeah, those are kind of some of the topics I wanted to go over, but you're free to ask me more about it later in detail. So we'll go on to the next person.
Awesome sauce. So this is like a very simple question. Like, are you a gamer? So raise your hand if you identify as a gamer. Right. Right. So when we have that question posed to us, right, are you a gamer? Right, we immediately think of ways that we identify as a gamer, and as most of us know who are gamers or identify as other things, it's very multifaceted. Gamer identity is not just one particular thing, right? Gamers are not a monolith, right? So it's very multifaceted, but what does that mean? So I came across this particular study, apologize for the formatting, but it's called How to Be a Gamer, exclamation point, right? Exploring personal and social indicators of gamer identity. So they literally try to figure out what particular factors are most salient to the gamer identity and see if that actually correlates to someone actually identifying as a gamer. Play frequency, so the amount of time someone plays, which gets into a very interesting conversation that I had with my Uber driver this morning, in which I was telling her about my research interests, and she had told me that she plays like this mobile game, like several mobile games, a lot. And I said over maybe 8 hours within like a day. She was like, oh, way more than that, of course, in a day. And I was just like, oh, okay. And then I asked her, but do you identify as a gamer? She was like, no. And I was like, really? Tell me more. And so she was like, well, I don't have a console. And so I was like, interesting, right? So this gets back to one of those physical, tangible objects, right, that we can determine ourselves to be a part of a gamer identity, right? So, such as like if I'm a cinephile, right? So if I really, really like film, right? Filmography, movies, stuff like that. You may have an extensive like collection of stuff, right? Something that you can physically show, right? But for her, no, not the same thing. And the next part of the study was genre, right? So fighting games, right? RPGs, type of things like that. Age. Turns out that you can be whatever age you are, and it really doesn't correlate if you identify as a gamer or not. So you're still good.
I am a gamer. A geezer gamer.
You're actually part of a growing demographic too, which is also interesting. And gender, so however you identify, and unfortunately in this study it's with the gender binary, so just men and women, but coming to find out that most men will identify as a gamer, but it's really marginally, and it depends on the specific type of genre that they're playing as well. And lastly, networks. Networks just in this regards relating to people, right? So groups of people, so talking games. That really means if you go into IGN, GameSpot, Polygon.com, like those kinds of sources to interact with other people who may identify as you. Play frequency, so playing games with others, right, for an extended amount of time, right? Do you identify as a gamer if you play with like your kid brother for like an hour, right? Does your kid brother identify as a gamer if he plays with you for like an hour or so? Does it take more? What does that mean, right? Co-play, so playing with others in general, right? So if you have a friend that you want to play maybe some type of mobile game or some type of console game with, right? Will you consider your friend a gamer if they're playing with you for some time, and vice versa? And then, of course, gender composition. So if you have a female friend or a male friend or whatever, does that relate in some case to identifying as a gamer? And I won't go into all of the details, basically, but the most salient one is playtime. Playtime is really the thing where most people kind of identify as a gamer. So if you play games for about like maybe an hour or two a day, or even a week, you may not consider yourself a gamer. But hardcore gamers, they tend to stray around like 8+ hours a week. Of course, more than that, right? And of course, you're playing 8 hours in a day. You may consider yourself a gamer. Maybe, I don't know, you know? And so I wanted to really talk about this particular picture. So if you weren't here before, I study the fighting game community. And this picture actually comes from the Evolutions Tournament 2017. So that was held in Las Vegas. It's the world's largest fighting video game space in the world. I think last year had over 14,000 competitors, and most of it was for Street Fighter, then Smash right after it. And so as I was observing the space, I just took this random picture, which I thought was just random, but when you actually look at it, there's a lot of things that's going on at play, especially in regards to identity. If you look at the space, you can distinguish like the gender discrepancy immediately, right? There are more men than women in the picture, even though looking at this room, it's probably 50-50 between men and women, right? Statistically, that is also true. But when you go to spaces such as this and other venues where video games are the most salient, you don't see the same gender representation, but that's because there's context there. Being a woman is vastly different than you are a man in video game spaces, point blank, right? Now, let's get to the racial component. If you look around, this is actually a pretty diverse community, which is why FGG spaces are also very interesting to me to study. But as you see, there's different kinds of ethnicities and races just in this one picture alone. So we take it a step further, look at what they're holding, the actual artifacts, as I call them, right? So you see one guy in the red shirt with the lanyard around him. What he's holding is a arcade fighting stick, which is really resembling that of an actual arcade cabinet, right? And that necessarily, as a competitor, you don't need. You can actually just play with a regular controller. However, it symbolizes that you are really serious about this competition if you have a fight stick, right? And I'm not for sure of the brand, but most fight sticks are 150 and up, right? So you have to invest some kind of money and also time, right? Because he's competing. All of them are competing against each other. That takes a certain amount of time. Right? If you're a newbie to this space, you may not want to wander in a competition space such as EVO. To be honest, this is like the NFL for most of these people. So if you're just walking in, I just wanted to, just play for fun, you may be looked at kind of differently, but it's still an inviting space nonetheless, right? So there's a lot of particular ways that us as gamers, right, or gamer identified people show how we are, right, as gamers, right? The things that we do, the ways we talk, right? As Joey mentioned, sometimes most of the research that I come across, they're not written by gamers, unfortunately, right? So the way to describe, I read a paper in which they described League of Legends as a MMO and not a MOBA. Also a psychologist too. So, but there's contextualization there, right? If you are a gamer identified person, you immediately would speak about certain things differently inherently when you're describing a game, right? For me, if I'm talking about Overwatch, I'm not going to say Overwatch is this big, large game that people play and you're on a team. I say no, it is a first-person team-based game that is 6v6, right? Unless you're playing some of those special matches, which are 3v3, and unless you're playing another special match, which is 1v1.
Wait, Lucio Ball. That's the real mode.
No, Mace Snowball fight. No, but anywho. But right, so in this one picture, there's a lot of things to contextualize in this space. So I just leave with these two quick questions just for us to ponder, right? What do these perceptions say, I meant to say about us, but about us as a gaming culture, right? So how do we perceive ourselves when someone identifies us as a gamer or anything other than that? What are they actually saying, right? In the paper that you mentioned, prototypical kind of attributes. So thinking of the stereotypes about gamers and how we may internalize those, but then reciprocate them back to the person in a different way, right? So most perceptions is that all gamers are pretty much living in their parents' basement, they're of a particular ethnicity, all that stuff. It's actually not true. Statistically, it's not true, right? But we understand these stereotypes, and so how do we internalize them and in turn bring it back on the other person, right? So when I tell people I study, video games, right, in graduate school, they're just like, wait, you can do that? And I was like, I know, right? Wow. So the next part to my slide is how do stereotypes affect and shape our sense of self, right, and others, right? So when you hear these stereotypes, what do you think about yourself? Do you feel like you fit into these particular molds? If you do, why and how did you get there, right? And then we think about others. Maybe the way you exemplify your gamer identity is different. Maybe some are more bashful, right? Sometimes maybe your colleagues say, I identify as a gamer, but I don't really show it out there. Or someone who plays lots of League of Legends, but don't say that they're a gamer, right? Or they play this particular mobile game like Candy Crush all day long, right? But does not identify as a gamer. Why is that, right? Yeah, that's it.
All right. Yeah, I was just thinking about how many of you would put on your Vita or resume for a job under interests. I'm a video gamer and I play such and such and such. Anybody ever do that? Good on you.
I did for my job.
Well, your job. Yeah.
I talked about memes in my interview. It helped.
But people put down like what stuff? Music, I play guitar, yeah, artist, so all
weights.
kinds of things like that. But you're not likely to put down that you play a video game. And yet, I was talking to my son-in-law, why not? In your work as an architect, you use virtual reality to walk through spaces with clients, and the more you play video games, the higher your skills are with spatial visualization, with technology, all these sorts of things. In fact, decades ago, kids in school were introduced to video games to increase computer literacy. And there is still a relationship between video game skills and work in IT, computer programming, blah, blah, blah. So, I, knowing that, raised my kids in encouraging them to play all the games on all the equipment, and I bought all the equipment, got the graphics cards, got the Voodoo card that my son wanted, and yeah.
And they're all super smart. So, yeah.
And they're all-
So it worked.
So it must be true.
Okay, I don't actually have any slides. Cool.
Because he has a whole class on it, so he doesn't need slides. Just start talking about your class.
Right.
So the weird thing, I'll just say a couple things about this class. I grew up identifying myself as a nerd, a total geek, because when I was, in high school, I was into ham radio and electronics and logic circuits. And so why did I end up in psychology? God, no. What? I was going to major in computer science. Swear to God. And my brother said, Kent, do you think that the next generation needs better transistor radios and junk like that, or solutions to human problems? And I said, okay, Brad, you're right. I'll go into psychology. I'll do my best to help in this profession. First year in psychology, I came so close to switching majors. And it wasn't because somebody was teaching the psychology of video games. It was because I found a course on mathematical psychology, the wedding of computational models and human behavior. Okay? And now at the end of my career, I see that video games and simulation are the wedding of computer science, computational modeling, artificial intelligence, and the human mind, interacting with all of this in this incredibly synergistic way. Now, I don't want to go really freaky on this, but, think about, has anybody heard of Jane McGonigal? Okay, she's this wacky woman who says we don't play enough video games because if we played more video games, we could solve all the world's problems. Now, she gets into serious games and that kind of stuff, which are to my mind, she's got the right message, but kind of fizzles out in the details. I think basically because she doesn't have doesn't have big name game companies working behind this, but she's writing her own games. They're cutesy, et cetera, et cetera. They're educational. But I think what we're going to actually see is the gamer mind working with the whole simulation industry, and I'm talking about the big companies, Microsoft, Activision, Blizzard, all of them, and the human mind now creating this game space that's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger with larger worlds and larger things to do. So the wacky part is, we'll spend all of our lives within these virtual worlds and video games, and we won't come out, and walk on streets anymore. I was on the panel yesterday on virtual reality and augmented reality, and hey, the game space is the real space. These two also will be united in augmented reality. So I'm seeing if I had, I wish I should have brought my augmented reality goggle thingy that I've got. And I would be looking out at half of you people, and half of you are, let's say, a few Marios here, the Zelda there, and all the video game characters that I might want to introduce. I mean, you could all be Pokemon thingies. So, but we can weld these two together in a way which becomes much more exciting and can create new things. Like, and essentially going through the solutions that my brother Brad really wanted is to live in a space which is very mental health nurturing. Someplace where I can feel comfortable, where all of my phobias and anxieties are alleviated just with the tweak of an AI agent within the game. Reading a lot of my biofeedback sensors, it knows when I'm upset, it knows when I'm anxious, and it knows when I'm like in the zone and in the flow.
And on the flip side of that, think of the horror games people could make if they could literally read your responses to stimuli.
Right, and so that's the downside. The downside is that some evil government takes over the video game industry and basically creates a bunch of human bots that will march to war against who knows who, or fly drones over Afghanistan and kill people, which we're doing. So what I would like is for you guys to pledge to join me in a better world through video games, creating a world where we will cooperate with others, we will be altruistic, where we will help the weak and defend, the poor, and really create this virtual, incredible heaven.
Here, here.
Thank you, thank you.
I do want to add a disclaimer. League of Legends is not an MMO, and if anyone refers to it as such, I will fight them. But yes, be peaceful.
All right. Is there anything else? Okay. Well, we have a few. Here's a few links here. Cognitron.umd.edu is one of the links.
/POVG for Psychology of Video Games.
Yep.
That's a.
And then lap.umd.edu. That's the webpage for Dr. Norman's lab at the University of Maryland. So you can check it out. It's actually a pretty cool webpage. I didn't make it, so I'm not biased. I actually didn't, seriously. I didn't. Now we have a few minutes actually for a Q&A. If you would rather just come up afterwards, I'm gonna stay after for a little bit, and maybe a few other people. I think everyone else is gonna stay after for a little bit if you guys just want to ask like one-on-one questions, or if we just don't get to your question. But if you at this time, if you have just a question about anything, feel free to ask. Should we do?
We have like 7 minutes.
We have 7 minutes. Yeah.
Repeat the question.
And repeat the question. Okay.
You were supposed to repeat that.
No.
You repeat the question.
Okay. I'll repeat the question.
So they can hear.
Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, can you? How about you go ahead? I think you were first.
Which
you in
one?
the you in the glasses.
You with the long hair?
Yes, you have the long hair.
Okay. So I had a question. Even though there are major events going on, say right now, the year of the loot box, and I agree that that's a major phenomenon, but because the market for video games is so complicated. There's so many different types of games, so many different types of genres. Does that create complications when you're developing theories about the way in which video games affect society? Like, for instance, when you're looking at the specializations you mentioned, like identity, for instance, or the role of video games as possible therapeutic tools, how does the complexity of the market affect what you're talking about?
Okay, so how does the complexity of the market...
I'll take that one.
Okay, well, Dr. Norman's going to take
Well,
that
we'll
question.
repeat the
But
question.
Okay. Yeah, I'm repeating the question. How does the complexity of the market play into the difficulty of like forming different theories and stuff like that? So I think Dr. Norman volunteered to take
Okay.
the question, so
So
go
that
ahead.
that is a huge problem in every area. And so what we try to do in psychology is, first of all, understand the stimulus, the complexity of everything out there, which includes the different genres, the aspects of all the video games, the systems, and then we go to understanding the individual differences among the players, which deals with the demographics, age, experience, culture, etc. We have to do that first. Without that groundwork, we don't know the complexity, and we do the kind of crazy stuff that Craig Anderson did and makes us kind of...
If you want to learn more about that, come tomorrow, 2:30.
All right.
Craig Anderson.
And so, so that first link goes to a book that is in progress that you can access. It's on a wiki. You can comment on it. And so the first part of it goes through all of these first aspects, the genre, the video game industry, how they're developed. And then the next part goes through individual differences. And then we get into the cognitive aspects, the skills aspects, and then into kind of the dark side of addiction and psychopathologies of video games. But you're absolutely right. And the gaming industry often becomes a little silo in which there's a bunch of guys that develop a game, and they developed it because that's what they like, and it's a very closed world. I had one of the lead producers of games at Bethesda GameWorks come and give a talk in my class, and I was trying to tempt one of the students to ask, so what are the demographics of Bethesda GameWorks and your developers? I knew that they were all male, every one of them, and they were making games that they wanted. So, so he basically did Skyrim, Elder Scrolls, those kind of games. Not to say that he wasn't a good family man. He had kids. The reason I knew him was because one of his sons was in my class on video games. So that was pretty cool. Does that answer the question? Is it further?
Well, I can follow up
That's
on that real
pretty good.
quick.
I'm getting at the idea of, so within the market you have like EA, Activision, Ubisoft. You have all the marketing activity, the game design activity that they're doing. But then even within the major space, you have companies like Paradox who are not touching loot crates at all. And that's just one example. There's dozens of others.
Yeah.
But then you have whole other entire divisions of the market with, the indie space.
Mm-hmm.
I think what he's trying to say is there's a lot of variance within gamers and
Yeah.
gaming itself. So treating it as a monolith becomes very difficult, right?
Right.
Yeah, well,
Right.
I guess it's really kind of a marketing strategy of, here's the whole world of people, and I'm trying to find that space that's not covered, and can I make a game for a group of people that are not yet brought into the market? That's one of the thoughts. The other is to exploit, the big gamers that are out there that are waiting for the next release of something, and pull them in or possibly drag them from some other space. What I find in my class is that sometimes people are into a genre and that's what they play. If they're a Madden or a FIFA, they do not get into an RPG. They can't, because they have learned the game mechanics, the controller in one way, and they cannot relearn it to play another game.
Yeah, and that does make video game research challenging because you're mentioning research and theories too. So whenever you're starting research with video gamers or video game players, you do have to define like what is a video game at the very beginning. So for my research, I defined it as a console, PC, or mobile video game. But not all researchers might do that. They might only look at console games and forget about PC and mobile games. So whenever you're doing a theory or a research project, you have to define what is a video game in this project that you count as a video game, and what do you count as a gamer or a video game player.
Yeah, I have a question. Is Words with Friends a video game? Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
think
video
it is.
game. It's
Why not?
video. It's certainly a game. It's
There it is.
with other people, and my wife is addicted to it, and she, says I'm the gamer, and she's not. She puts in more hours of gaming than I do in a week.
I think the better question is TurboTax a video game?
Yeah, but I keep losing it.
Yeah. Oh, he says yes. Okay. We have a question over here in the. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it might be more for Javon, but more than anyone.
Okay.
How do you think the gamer identity demographic will change over time as our gaming capabilities continue to grow?
How will the question is how will the gamer identity demographic change over time? So, and it's for Javon, but anyone can take it. It doesn't have to be
Of
just
all
for tonight.
questions to get, that's like 5. Okay, how would I break this down? Because it's a very great question, and I really like the question because it's multi-layered, I would say. Because demographics in the gaming spaces, you have to first figure out what level you're talking at. So industry-wise, we need more women in spaces. Once we get more women in spaces, we need more women of color. No, actually, people of color in general, right? Because I read an Independent Game Developer Association report from 2015, which basically did a survey of like 2,000 developers around the world. About 80% were Caucasian European, and then the rest were a mixture of Asian, and then African American, and then Latinx kind of people, and then that was it. When you talk about men and women, it is pretty much 80%, right, to like the 20%, right? Now there are blips, of course, where spaces may not look as the same monolith, but those are far and few between. Demographic-wise, with more gaming capabilities, I do hope that people who, first of all, I hope that people who have particular disabilities, first of all, can start to play more. I saw a video not so long ago about a person who can't see at all, but yet can whoop your ass in Street Fighter, right? And I was mesmerized because I was just like, how does he do that? And he literally just listens to the differentiations of sounds per attack, right? Which makes him fundamentally just gets ready to queue up for certain things before you make the next move because he hears your attack first and immediately can distinguish what to do immediately, right? So first we need more people who are enabled to do so by traditional means, right? So if you can't play with your physical arms, is there something else we can do? So we need more people like that. Then also, we need more people of color, not only in spaces where game development happens, but also where game research happens at the same time. And then the next level, as far as like demographics, like what the average gamer looks like, that's more of a hard question because when it comes to racial demographics of research, I can't tell you what it looks like. I really can't. It's hard to tell you what it looks like. I can project, but I can't. But pretty much is 50-50. What we need is to remove the statistic and actually have representation. But before we get to representation of these spaces, we need to first and foremost identify the several barriers, right, that happen on why these demographics aren't as prolific in these spaces as they should be, right? The FGC, I love the FGC, and it's very diverse. The reason I'm targeting the FGC is because of its diverse space. You can't find the same thing if you go to a Call of Duty tournament. You can probably imagine what the demographic is just by the name of it. Probably, right? Same thing for other types of popular games, right? When you look at a tournament, next time you look at a tournament and you look at the people who are playing in certain tournaments on Twitch or however you look at your streaming content, look at who's actually playing, right? And try to remove the context of where they're from in their country, right? So if you're like rooting for Team USA, look at the composition of who's comprising of Team USA. They probably look all the same, of the same age range, pretty much, right? So we first need to address some of the barriers that is hindering people from entering these spaces. Hopefully with new technology, then we can start to see more proclivity in all forms of demographics. I hope that answers your question.
I think we can take one more question, and I'm sorry, if you weren't able to ask the question, definitely come up, we'll be here. So I did see your hand first, I think.
This is for everyone.
Okay.
As someone who studies psychology, knowing people's behaviors because they do this because of that and they do this because of that circumstance, does knowing that much about human behavior kind of take away the fun of being around people? Do you ever feel kind of like alone knowing so much in a way?
Well, can I answer this question first?
Sure.
I don't
repeat the question.
So the question is, does knowing about psychology and knowing about human behavior take the fun out of? Sorry, what was the last part? Take the fun out of like
Interacting or
the human
drive you to
experience.
kind of isolation if
Yeah.
you can expect people to do
Yeah.
certain things.
Well, I don't know. I like social psychology. That's kind of more of my expertise. So that stuff is like social cues, group, how groups process. I'm really interested in that kind of stuff. I do probably overanalyze a lot of situations, and my wife tells me I do. So I probably definitely do. I probably overanalyze her behavior. I don't know. I don't know if it takes away from the human experience. I think it's cool. I mean, I'm biased because I'm the one overanalyzing and whatever. But I don't know. I'm not a psychic. Like just because we're psychologists doesn't. I don't think that just because we're psychologists that makes us like psychic.
No,
Like,
don't reveal
I
us.
can't predict. Oh, sorry. We're not.
Come on.
I think maybe sometimes there's misportrayal of like the capabilities of some psychologists, like in movies and in the media, where some movies may portray that like psychologists to be like to know everything, to like be psychics, and I'll tell you straight up, I don't know that much, and I don't know. I can't look at someone and be like, I know your whole life. Like I definitely can't do that.
Yeah.
I'm not a psychic. But I do. Like knowing and understanding like different group mechanisms, social cues, and stuff like that. I probably do use it to overanalyze. Does anyone else want to answer that question?
Yeah, I kind of do. I think we're running a little bit over time.
We are
but,
a little over. Thanks for the question, but it's okay.
Just
No one's kicking us out yet. And I think we're pretty late. It's okay.
Nobody's
We can take
walking
it.
up, so I don't know if there's a panel directly after us. But
Oops. It's okay.
I don't know the schedule.
This is
but
important. This is
if you
psychology,
are supposed to be up here right now, please kick us off. Okay. Well, so one of a very important thing to remember whenever doing psychology or I think sociology studies is that everything you have a very you can look at group trends, but individual variation is incredibly specific, so you can never make assumptions to that regard in that respect. But looking up things like social cues, trying to do things like mirror behavior, that I found that to be helpful in terms of better connecting.
Yeah.
But all right.
All right, we need to adjourn, but thank you guys so much for coming. We're very thankful that you guys decided to come on a Friday night at 10 p.m. to learn about psychology and video games. We'll be up here for a little bit. Then I'm gonna go play Smash Bros. So if you want to come up and ask questions, feel free. And thank you guys so much. Enjoy the rest of the weekend, and I hope you all have a great MAGFest. Thank you. Love you all.